The word here is used in the question of the epidemic of autism and this idea that diagnosis rates are on the rise and that the prevalence is confusing for a lot of folks. Is it simply the fact that the technology has gotten better? What do you say when people use words like epidemic or feel like the diagnosis rates are going up in the world?
The rates are going up. So let's deal with the facts first.
Yeah.
We give more diagnoses now than we used to give before.
Right.
So if we count how many diagnoses we give more diagnoses.
Okay.
Okay? Fact. Why is that, is the question.
Yes.
Right? So to call it an epidemic, we would have to assume that there is some cause out there that makes it more likely that people actually have autism.
Yes.
Not that they get a diagnosis of autism, but that they have autism, right? Lots of things have changed over the last few years. We give autism diagnosis to many more people than we used to do before, partly because we changed criteria, partly because there is a lot of awareness and we're training family doctors, nurse practitioners, pediatricians to give diagnosis.
Right.
So when people recognize this combination of some social difficulties and some repetitive behaviors, they will give the diagnosis of autism. In my book, so a lot of this is just us calling autism, giving the label of autism to many more people than we did before. Not that the people are different.
Right.
Right? So the actual incidence or prevalence of autism, we can be 100% sure that there is no change at all. That's why we study environmental factors. That's why we study epigenetics. So that there is anything, we will actually capture it. But the vast majority of the increase in the number of diagnoses is because we're getting better at giving diagnosis. And the system knows now how to give diagnosis, and families are aware of autism, and they go and ask their doctor about autism, and they're more likely to get diagnosis. So we're giving many more diagnoses. Right. We can think of this as a good thing or a bad thing. And there's no right way to think about this. The good way to think about this is more people who need supports get supports. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. That's right. Okay. More people who need supports get supports. The bad thing about this is it's not one condition, right? So we give more diagnoses, meaning people who were not getting the diagnosis before get the diagnosis now. People who have high needs get the diagnosis, the same label as people who may not have as many needs. So thinking through how we tailor the interventions to the preferences and needs of this very wide spectrum is our challenge now. That's why we're talking about precision health. That's why we're talking about identifying the subgroups that may need more tailored approaches, because now we use the term to mean anybody who pretty much has difficulties in those two areas, the social area and the repetitive behaviors. Okay. So that's a very, very broad spectrum now. Makes perfect sense that the numbers have gone up because now we gave it to everybody who has this combination of those two kind of differences. We just now have the challenge of thinking, how do we meet the needs of all this spectrum, the very wide spectrum?
Okay, so
I just add one thing.
For sure.
Because if you look worldwide, there's been epidemiological studies done in probably 24 or so countries worldwide. The rates are roughly the same.
Okay.
There's some variation, and I think it's really important to point out, because we're going to talk about misinformation, is in every population that's been studied so far, there have been reports of autism.
Right.
Okay, so it was mentioned in the White House release that there were some groups that did not have autism.
Right.
And there must have been a reason for that. They weren't vaccinated or whatever it was. It's not true. In fact, right after I did some quick Googling, and you can find all kinds of papers there. I've read scientific literature. And what I wanted to just also say, just to maybe put a somewhat of a closing comment on the genetics is, and this is a form of validation. You'll hear we use the term replication and validation over and over again. Anytime you make an observation or a quote-unquote discovery, you have to replicate it. That's the rigor of evidence-based science and medicine. And what we did for these 100 or so genes that are now used for diagnostic testing, we checked to see if they're involved in populations in Asia, in Africa, in North America, in Europe, and the same genes come up over and over again. As you would expect, as I mentioned earlier, there are random genetic changes happening in every one of us. You would expect them to happen in every population. So that's a form of validation In fact, we'd actually found the exact same chemical base, the single nucleotide letter of the book in the library.
Yep.
In different people from different countries, in a gene called, it's a so-called prototypical autism gene, synaptic scaffolding 1, SHANK3 gene, in probably two dozen different people from around the world that all have autism.
Okay.
So that's a form of experimental validation,
Right.
that I would use as a definition.